Tamika Edwards is the director of the Social Justice Institute at Philander Smith College. She's also been a longtime contributor for us at Talk Business and Politics. She and I discussed the state of race in Arkansas and those latest poll numbers. Let's begin with, what is social justice? This is a term that I think has been out there in our vernacular even more in the last couple of weeks because of the George Floyd protest.
Correct.
How do you define social justice?
So in its simpler form, I define social justice, and I think many people will, as it's a concept of fair and just relations between individuals and the society, right? So the reason that we're hearing so much about social justice is oftentimes people see it through their individual justices, the things that they work on, such as criminal justice, racial justice, economic justice. And so in any of those things, you see where people are arguing for or purporting for a fair and just relation of that individual and the society. And so in all terms, it just reminds me of what my mother would always say, just do what's right. And if we would do what's right, then we wouldn't have such a push for social justice because we would already be in fair and just relationships.
So in pushing for social justice and pushing for doing what's right, it's a combination of changing laws,
Correct.
setting policy, maybe just regulations, guidelines, procedures, things like that. What about just doing what's right?
Well, so one of the things that I focus a lot on as it relates to social justice is public policy, because as people have said that budgets determine your priorities, I believe the policies that we pass do the very same thing. If you review or think about the history of our country, our public policies have been in place to condition us to act a certain way. And so when we have put those things in place for such a long time, it's difficult for people to change. So the public policies will start the types of priorities and thinking and shift that we want to see. I think a prime example is what Sheriff Higgins has done with the Sheriff's Department, where it's now a requirement that if you see a fellow deputy doing something that's wrong, even when the situation has been taken care of, that deputy is required to intervene. And that's a public policy shift that I think is really important, because it's just doing what's right.
What about the things that can't be changed through policy or directive?
Well, so I think those things will happen over time when society shifts. Right. So, I mean, even if we look at the unrest in this country, it's because a public policy was set in place that does not enable accountability. Once we see those things that are unacceptable and people start to speak out, even when you look at what's happening now, corporations that have never spoken out before recognize this moral and ethical shift even without public policy. So I think a lot of things can determine it, the way that we interact with one another, but also the public policies that we put in place to encourage people to act differently. I'm not saying that we legislate hearts and minds, but over time, the way that we interact probably will have that impact.
Let's talk about public opinion. We're releasing some poll numbers this morning here. We asked a question about racism. Is it a big problem? Is it a little problem? Is it somewhat of a problem? Is it not a problem at all? Combined, 74% feel that racism is a big or somewhat of a problem in Arkansas.
Right.
Does that surprise you?
It surprises me because it's Arkansas, and when you think of our numbers of black people here, we don't make up the majority of the state. So for that to be a combined number, for people to recognize that now, I would argue that black folks have always known that, but for the majority of Arkansans to recognize that, I think is a huge shift. And I think that's primarily because many people who watched the video of Mr. Floyd's death saw a human being literally lose or have his last breath right before their very eyes, where you had a police officer who was sworn to protect and serve, had his hands in his pockets while kneeling on his neck. And that image, I believe people it was the last straw. For many of us, we already knew, but I do believe it was the last straw for many Arkansans.
It's a game changer, for sure.
I think it was.
So we asked too about whether the police treat whites better, blacks better, or treat them equally. 50% police treat whites better, 41% treat whites and blacks equally. That to me seems like a big opinion shift as well.
I believe it is too. I think that the unrest and the stories that are coming from black people about their experiences, not only in dealing with racism, but their experiences in dealing with police officers, they are telling more stories and talking to more of their friends. And I also think that white folks are starting to want to even hear and listen to those stories, because when you see it for yourself, you simply cannot deny the inevitable.
We've seen things before, though. We've seen
have.
Rodney King. We've seen Mr. Brookshire here in Little Rock, for instance. I mean, there have been instances where we've seen video before.
That's right.
Why do you think this is so much more compelling?
Well, I think a lot of things have been leading up to it. So if you think of the three things that happened over a short period of time when individuals have been unarmed, you think of Ahmaud Arbery, while he was jogging and was gunned down by individuals who felt that it was okay to do this kind of thing, even though one of them was a former police officer. You saw Breonna Taylor, who has ties to Arkansas, was minding her, sleep in her own home, and a no-knock warrant where police officers just felt it was okay to kick down a door, and then she died. And now we see Mr. George Floyd, who was already apprehended, handcuffed, and was murdered. Those things in a short period of time, especially with people being much more thoughtful about the conversations, I think it was just something that was pushed over the edge. Some of the other things that we've seen may have been spaced out, but I think it's just time is up. Now is the time to start talking and being courageous about these issues.
You're going to be on a Little Rock task force to look at some potential changes to policing. The governor has announced a statewide task force for this purpose as well. And then you have what's going on at the Social Justice Institute, which I suspect you may have your hands full.
I do.
These days. How is all of that going to work together? What is your expectation for what will happen?
So with the Independent Review Committee, we're looking at the policies, procedures, and all of those things as an independent third party of the Little Rock Police Department. And so we'll have conversations and see what's happening and what the overlaps are, or what some of those concerns will be. I don't believe that it's so different with the governor's task force, as it will be a statewide look at some of those policies and procedures.
Do you think y'all may work in some tandem?
I think so, and I think the governor alluded to that even in the press conference, that we will probably have some learnings from one another. But ultimately, I do believe that there will be some policy recommendations and hopefully public policy change.